moving from a sedentary to a physically active societal way of life. This is Up on Our Feet.
Welcome to Up on Our Feet. For quite some time, we've known that exercise and physical activity in general are good for our bodies. We're healthier, more fit, stronger when we're physically active. And within the past 2 decades or so, we've learned that exercise and physical activity are also good for our brains and our overall mental health. The brains of those who are regularly physically active operate at a higher, more efficient level and age more slowly than the brains of more sedentary people. And those who are regularly physically active are also less likely to experience anxiety, depression, dementia, things like this. And now, today's emerging research is just beginning to show us something else. It may not be only a matter of being physically active itself or a matter of what types of physical activity you do, but where you actually do your physical activity may be an important and determining factor in the benefits you get out of it, especially as this relates to what are called natural spaces, including green spaces, or what we often refer to as flora, vegetation, and plant life, and what are called blue spaces, areas near water. And someone who is part of this emerging research is Professor David Lubans, the Deputy Director of the University of Newcastle Center for Active Living and Learning in Newcastle, Australia, which is about a 2-hour drive north of Sydney. Professor Lubans is also a member of the American Sports Institute's International Board of Advisors. Professor Lubans, it's nice to have you with us.
Joel, my pleasure to be here.
All right, thank you. All right, so this is such a unique and intriguing perspective that where you actually do your physical activity may be an important and determining factor in the benefits you get out of it. How or why did you and others ever think to examine how physical activity might impact people differently if it's done in different environments, especially regarding these green and blue spaces, as opposed to indoors or in dense city areas?
Yeah, great question to start with, Joel. And I think we can all think back from an evolutionary perspective and understand that being connected to nature and the natural environments that human beings grew up in would have had an advantage, had an evolutionary advantage, helped you to survive, helped you be more successful in life. And therefore, it's probably not that surprising that the time that we spend in those environments is really helpful for our health and well-being across a range of different outcomes. And there's actually a range of different theories that have been sort of presented as a way of explaining why this might actually be the case. And one of the interesting ones I find is called stress recovery theory. And this is all this idea that being in a natural environment helps to reduce stress levels and helps to blunt cortisol levels. And it clearly has these ways of just restoring us back to our balance and the way that we are supposed to be existing. And another theory that's been thrown about is one called attention restoration theory. And this is about effects of being in nature on concentration and cognitive function. And this idea that when we spend a lot of time in man-made environments, our cognitive energies are depleted and fatigued. And therefore, going back into nature and spending time in nature helps to build those back up and help us be at optimal levels. And therefore, it's kind of natural to start thinking that maybe physical activity done in natural environments is going to have the one benefit of being in the nature and then enhancing the actual benefit that you'd get from doing that physiological activity as well.
Okay. And so then what do the recent and emerging studies tell us about the where of physical activity and how its impact is different in different environments? What's it telling us?
Yeah, well, I think there's now some definitely systematic review and meta-analysis level evidence showing that the same dose of physical activity done in a natural environment has added mental health and some physical health benefits compared to activity done in a man-made environment. And I think this was really well illustrated in an acute study conducted by Bratman and colleagues that compared the effects of two 90-minute walks. And they're looking at the effects of walking on rumination, which is like this thinking, overthinking, and kind of leads to internalizing problems, and also actual neural activity in the prefrontal cortex, or the part of the brain that's actually can lead to problems with depression and anxiety. And this fascinating study showed that 90 minutes of walking in a man-made environment just around a university campus had no effect on rumination and an effect on brain activation in this part of the brain. But 90 minutes of activity done in a very natural environment actually led to reductions in rumination and reductions in brain activation in this prefrontal cortex, kind of demonstrating both a psychological response, but also stemming from neurobiological changes in the brain. And these are just like a sample of the type of research that's being out there, showing that exercise and activity done in natural environments has added mental health benefits. And more research is really testing the idea of activity done in blue spaces. And that's, as you mentioned earlier in your introduction, activity done in the water or near waterways, in the oceans and rivers and lakes. And that this was a similar experiment, which was a crossover trial, and they showed that they had improved well-being and mood after walking just for 20 minutes in a blue space, and the effects were stronger than those that were observed after doing the same amount of activity in an urban space. So, yeah, it really is building a large amount of evidence that that there's something special about activity done in natural spaces.
Okay, and if you were just talking about the effects on the mental well-being and things like this. Of course, if you go for a run anywhere, it helps you physiologically. Does this mean that if you go for a run or a brisk walk by a body of water or in an open field or up in the hills or something like that, that the physiological benefits would be greater or better than
it's not suggesting the physiological difference. So it's not going to have a difference in terms of the effect on your cardiorespiratory fitness, or probably not your metabolic health. But there may be some neurobiological differences, and that's what that study on the university campus suggested. So I think there's no reason to suggest that the same dose of activity is going to have done in different environments going to affect your fitness in a different way. But it does appear to have a difference in its neurobiological effects. So that could be to do with brain activation or even the types of neurotransmitters that are released in response to exercise of different intensity. So that's probably in some ways a little bit of the new frontier as to what's the neurobiology going on here and what's actually explaining these mental health benefits. So being in natural spaces is certainly good. And even I think there's some really good epidemiological data that suggests that people who spend more time in green spaces have better physical health, they have better metabolic health. And clearly we can't just sort of separate mind and body. All of these things are interconnected. And if you're having you're doing activity that for your mind, it's also going to have good effects on your metabolic health as well. But I think that the new frontier is trying to figure out what's actually happening in the brain when you do activity in different environments.
Okay, so this sounds like it's also, I think when people go on vacation, they don't go into a, inner city area to go. They say, I want to get away from it all. And they go to the mountains, they go to the ocean, they go to the desert in these open spaces, these natural environments. And from what you're saying, it's almost like they're getting a mental break, a psychological break when they do that. And of course, people have been doing that for decades, if not centuries.
Yeah, absolutely, for centuries. I think you could even sort of take that a step further and say that, because there are some people who choose to go to cities or go to casinos for their breaks and who actually go into those sort of man-made environments. I think you could probably say that type of break is not going to have the same restoration effects as a break that is done in a natural environment. I think that there's enough evidence to say that taking breaks and spending time in blue and green spaces is the best way of restoring your cognitive and your your both your mental health and your cognitive health.
Okay. So this is what the research is telling us. Where is all this research on the where of physical activity going? What's its direction? What might it be able to do for humanity in the big picture?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I think first, and maybe one area that we know that has direct implications is the way that communities, societies, schools are designed. So actually creating pleasant green environments in schools, creating neighborhoods that have lots of trees, increasing the nature availability to all populations is a key priority, and it's a key priority because it's going to have some of these restorative effects, but it's also going to help as a secondary benefit, address some of the challenges of climate change, and as countries get hotter, having more green space and more shade and more places that people want to go to is going to help improve their physical and mental health. I think in terms of exercise prescription, I think it has real implications as well. So I would say with a lot of confidence now that the same dose of activity done in a natural environment is going to have better mental health benefits for someone than done in a man-made environment. So let's start prescribing that message. And that was really linked in with our recent position statement from Sports Medicine Australia and the Australian Psychological Society. And we came up with a number of recommendations. And one of our recommendations for physical activity for mental health promotion, because as you know, the physical activity guidelines that currently exist for both the US and Australia and the World Health Organization, they don't give too much information or guidance around where physical activity should take place. And they probably don't have as much around focusing on the mental health benefits. So I think we're going to see guidelines and national, international guidelines that start to reflect the importance of where physical activity is done, because you can't ignore this growing body of evidence that being active in green and blue spaces has added mental health benefits. And if we start to understand that message, then the way we promote physical activity, the way we prescribe, and the guidelines that really dictate those messaging, just can't ignore this information.
Yeah. Okay. A short while ago, you brought up the issue of the schools and kids in schools and things like that. What do you think would be the impact on school children if they could be in a when they're learning, they're in an environment that is more, let's say, that would be a lot easier, that's greener as opposed to blue. Trying to find the water, that'd be tough. But if you could green their environment more, what would be the impact, do you think, on their mental health? What would be the impact on their academic performance? And I know you've done a lot working with physical activity and school children. So what would be the impact there?
Yeah, well, I think you would have immediate benefits for their mood and for their their general well-being. And I think that there's enough to suggest that it's actually going to contribute to better cognitive function, which may in turn, in the long term, lead to better academic outcomes. Again, we can't ignore this evidence. This is really quite compelling when you look at the dozens and maybe even hundreds of studies that are now showing that being in a natural environment helps to restore our cognitive function, helps to improve our mood, helps to improve our well-being. When young people feel better about themselves and they're happier and they're healthier, it's more conducive to learning. So they're clearly going to be able to retain information more effectively, to manipulate that information, and which is ultimately going to have academic benefits. So I think, again, it's going to become harder and harder to ignore the data, and the data are very compelling that being in natural environments supports well-being and it supports learning, and it's what we should be promoting.
Okay, so in this context, this is really interesting. In this context, I don't know about Australia, but here in America, you read almost daily that we have a mental health crisis with our, especially adolescents, not so much the really young kids, but the adolescents. So could it be that the actual physical environment that the kids are supposedly learning in to get an education may be, in a sense, contributing to their mental health issues, and that if the schools were in some way able to change that, that would contribute to the kids being more mentally healthy?
Yeah, well, I think, I mean, I'm not going to suggest that the mental health, the mental health crisis that you referred to, which is a fact that it's really a global phenomena, is not going to be solved by one issue, but clearly activity and the environments that we exist in are massive contributors. Obviously, we can't exclude the role of social media and screen time and all of those things, but those things often displace as well. So spend a lot of time on screens, you spend less time in nature. But I think it is worth exploring the effects of increasing the green space in schools and with that activity opportunities, because I do think that there is the potential for that to have genuine mental health benefits. It's not the only thing that's going to solve this big problem. This is a really big problem, but it clearly is going to contribute to it. So finding ways for schools to listen to this information. And I'm not sure about the US, but it's pretty rare. Most Australian schools don't have really good green, natural environments available. Some will have little pockets and might have some little sections, but the focus has often been more on utilizing space for fields and for organized activity. But having access nearby to green parks and natural spaces is really going to be such an important thing to do for our young people. And I think educating them about that as well, because there might be that it's just not something that their parents or they themselves really see as a priority. And I know in Australia, there children's independent the amount of space they're allowed to move around in has decreased over time, and previous generations children were allowed to roam more, and now fears of safety, road safety and stranger danger have kind of led to a reduction in the free space of young people, and that may have also contributed to reducing their exposure to natural environments. So reminding parents that the benefits of getting out into these green and blue spaces is just so important for the development. And so school can both provide the exposure itself through changing their environments, but they can also increase awareness of why this is such an important thing.
Right. Yeah. So the school can be both a positive or negative contributing factor, not the sole factor, but contributing factor regarding the green spaces and the environments in which kids are learning. I imagine this is also true then for adults, as far as them being able to get out to and find these kinds of spaces or having these spaces close to them. It may not be the issue, but a contributing factor. Yes?
Well, the data is really saying it's a major contributing factor. And I think I read some research recently that also kind of connects space and time spent in the quality and quantity of green space time with loneliness. And loneliness is a real problem in many of our societies. And so it's probably not surprised to see that those people who spend more time in green and blue spaces feel less lonely and feel more connected, whether that's through the actual connection with other human beings in these natural environments, or that connection with nature itself helps to kind of reduce concepts of loneliness. Because clearly we did not evolve to live in concrete jungles. Certainly our society, we evolved into an industrial society so quickly, and our psychology has not caught up to that change of environment, and so finding ways to increase that exposure to green natural spaces is so important.
Okay. So in general, and I don't know if you've thought about this, but in general, what are the long-term socioeconomic implications of the wear of physical activity and its impact on wellness?
Well, I mean, socioeconomic disadvantage is such a strong predictor of physical, mental, cognitive health. That's just so well known, and I would probably be safe to argue that the environments that people of socioeconomic disadvantage are exposed to are going to have less of those health enhancing characteristics. You compare the average environment of an affluent area in California to a more impoverished area, and you could very quickly tick off the quantity and quality of the natural environments, that how different they would be. And it's not too much of a stretch to suggest that that's part of the thing that's driving these inequities. So maybe one way of thinking about how do we address inequality in society, changing the environments, or even increasing the exposure of people in disadvantaged areas to high quality natural environments is going to be one way of addressing that. And as an example, this is a very kind of a low micro level, is that the surf therapy approach is become really popular in recent years. It's been going for about 20 years now, but this is a way of taking individuals who may be at risk of poor mental health, or who actually have psychological disorder, and spending time in the ocean and receiving some therapy in that natural environment. And it seems to be a really powerful process for improving mental health. And it's not surprising in a lot of ways that the environment of the beach and the environment of the ocean has this restorative effect, and that you're combining that with some therapy is just going to blow other types of approaches out of the water. And excuse the pun.
That's all right. So really, this has a lot to do with where people decide to live and their socioeconomic condition, and where they may want to live somewhere else, but if they're in a certain socioeconomic bracket, they have no choice and they're kind of stuck. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the challenge, because it's all good and well to say to society, go and spend time in nature environments, but if you don't have the funds to get out of a housing commission blocks with grey walls and no parks or minimal park space anywhere, that message just kind of falls flat. So there is some real social equity implications for this type of research, and it's not necessarily a very cheap or easy thing to change, because once communities have been developed and suburbs have been designed, it's hard to kind of retrofit. But it would definitely suggest that if we can increase the quality and quantity of the green spaces available to more people, there's going to be psychological benefits and even physical benefits too.
Right. So from what you're saying, it sounds like that there are some major economic implications here. And I don't mean just from a socioeconomic perspective of people, but if we're talking about increasing the amount of, in particular, again, that'd be tough to do with water, but with green spaces, that can be done. But the whole issue of how properties are used, and people who are developers want to make money off their properties, but if we're saying we need more green spaces for the overall well-being of the people who are going to live there, it seems like there are these forces coming together that may end up locking horns, where one has to do with the well-being of people and the other is the developers, where they want to maximize their profits. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think they necessarily have to be competing in a way, because I think if developers follow the evidence and listen to what the research is saying, and the research is saying that people are happier, people are healthier, people are thriving when you design communities that take these considerations into these design considerations. I mean, there's a researcher, Thomas Astelbert from University of Wollongong, who's doing a lot of research in this space, and he's really starting to work with urban planners, and his work is influencing policy to change the way that communities are designed, and I think that's the best thing for everyone.
Yeah. Okay. So, this all sounds wonderful, and you start to see, when we started your interview, you opened up with talking about evolution. You see how, in a way, the research is pointing us in the direction that we need to pay more attention to our evolutionary makeup, our genetic makeup, for people to thrive physically, neurologically, emotionally. In this context, knowing what the research is saying, is there any threat or resistance coming from any type of any groups of or organizations that want to not acknowledge this because it would be a threat to them? Does that exist in any way?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that I don't think necessarily that people would, or groups would, see this as a threat, but there is the ever present financial, bottom line. I mean, what does it cost? What does it cost? How achievable is it? And cost is such a driver of the decisions that governments make, and the developers are influenced by that. That's everyone's trying to think about. And I think that there's always going to be more that could be done. There's never going to be, we've hit saturation point, we've got enough, it's all good, because there's always a tension between maximizing profit and making things done cheaply. But I think the really important message that's coming out of this work is that the environment really matters. And I think, there's obviously, I don't work in that space. I don't work in the urban planning place. And that's not my realm. I'm really interested in what the implications of this for schools and for physical activity promotion, because that's where my energies are invested. And it certainly makes me think about the way that I do activity, and it makes me think about the way that I promote and design interventions. And I can say very confidently from my own experience that when I'm thinking about going to do some physical activity, if I can do it in a natural environment with a view of the ocean, that's going to be my preference, because I know I'm going to feel better and it's going to be just a more pleasant experience. Not everyone, that's not always going to be achievable. But I think if we can start to kind of get that message out that you are going to get a better effect if you do it in this sort of setting, and you are going to be more likely to want to come back and do it again if that's the case. Part of it's education, part of it's promotion, part of it's policy change and environmental change. And I think there will always be resistance, but the data is pretty compelling. The data are compelling, sorry.
That's okay. All right, final question. Over the course of your entire professional career, and with all the studies you've done, programs you've implemented regarding how physical activity impacts human beings, and I know as you said, you've done a lot of work in schools and with learning and school children. In the big picture of things, what's the big message, the big takeaway, the major conclusion you've come to?
Oh, wow, that is a big one. I think because I do a lot of work with children and adolescents, I think the big picture, there's probably two parts to it. The first is, young people are not great at self-regulation, which is not that surprising to anyone who's a parent or a teacher. So we as adults have enormous responsibility to send young people down the right path, and by providing the right opportunities and the right information, so that ultimately, we need to be able to kind of set them off on a path of independence, but understanding this tension between, the fact that if you say to a group, go off and do your activity and come back and, unassisted or unsupported, it's unlikely it's going to happen most of the time. So finding things that, finding ways to embed activity into the day for young people is going to ensure that they get that physical activity experience and those physical activity benefits. That's probably the first thing, is just the importance of, teachers, parents, coaches, of controlling that experience, both in terms of the quantity of that experience and the quality of that experience. And if we give them enough quantity and we give them enough quality, then hopefully we can kind of send enough of them onto on a journey that's going to, that they're going to make the right choices when the choice is theirs to be made. I think that the first thing is that's probably it. Quantity and quality of experiences really, really matter. And I guess the second one is really just how, in promoting activity with young people, that the mental health benefits is what really matters. I mean, I'm not suggesting that physical health isn't important, and metabolic health and obesity, these things, but just looking at the challenges that young people face today, and you identified it yourself, this global mental health crisis that we're experiencing, the role of physical activity in buffering those psychological stresses is just enormous. And so more we can do to both promote those opportunities, but also explain and so that young people understand that link, because that's going to help them to make that choice when the choice is theirs to make. So quality and quantity experiences, and the role of physical activity for mental health and stress reduction in young people. That's really the take homes that I've been that my work has really kind of thrown to me.
Okay. Professor David Lubans of the University of Newcastle in Australia, thanks for being with us on Up on Our Feet.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.